Finally, on July 23rd, a Native American brings word to the fort that help is on the way.
This same Native American courier had stopped in the British camp, and he shared the same information with the British. So everybody knew this relief force was coming down the river road.
Wasting little time, the British take up defensive positions 1 mile south of the fort at a place called La Belle Famille. On the morning of July 24th, some 500 British and irregular soldiers wait for a French relief force of over 1,000 men.
They waited until the French were within about 30 yards, 90 feet.
Within 30 minutes, the French attack has collapsed.
It's a very brief, very bloody affair, and it is absolutely the last nail in Pouchot's coffin in terms of defending the fort.
Pouchot decides to give up the fort and ask the British for terms of surrender.
The entire length of the Fort Niagara siege covered about 19 days. That's a very respectable length of time for a fort like Niagara to hold out against a besieging army. In fact, it's one of the longer sieges in the history of North America.
The British capture of Fort Niagara severs the French lifeline to the west. In North America, the Great War for Empire is all but over. The Union Jack would fly over Fort Niagara for the next 4 decades. British occupation transforms the fort. For the rest of the 18th century, British forces centered at Niagara control access to the Great Lakes. With forts running from Nova Scotia to northern Michigan, they exert their dominance over the region.
The minute that the British expelled the French, their attitude toward the Indians, who they had previously needed as allies to fight the French, turned very, very arrogant. The Western Indians saw the British as a big threat. They knew that when the British came, they brought settlers. They knew the settlers took over land.
In 1763, the Indians rebel. They attack and capture virtually every British outpost on the Great Lakes. Only Forts Detroit and Niagara survive.
It very quickly is a lesson learned for the British. One of the other problems that they have now is a change in enemies. The French are gone from Canada and from the northern part of North America at least, and now Fort Niagara is going to be facing once again more a native threat than a European threat. And so they have to reevaluate the design of the fort and the defenses of the fort.
At 2 corners of the fort, the British build stone towers called redoubts. These small 3-story buildings were forts within a fort.
These are very effective strongholds. They're designed to hold about 25 men, and there are cannon platforms up on the 3rd floor.
One of the British officers involved in the construction of these buildings said that no force of Native Americans would ever pass between the fire of these 2 buildings in an attempt to attack Fort Niagara.
In the spring of 1775, a new rebellion is brewing. Colonists on the eastern seaboard are challenging British rule. During the 8-year war for American independence, Fort Niagara became a sanctuary for those who opposed the revolution.
During the revolutionary period, you see a lot of these loyalists fleeing to Fort Niagara for British protection. Many of these individuals are formed into military units of sorts, irregular military units to be sure, but very, very effective ones.
Beginning in 1778, John Butler, a New York farmer, and Joseph Brant, a Mohawk chief, lead raids against American settlements.
During the American Revolution, the Iroquois were very successful by sending small groups into agriculturally productive areas. And New York was the breadbasket, really, of the colonies. And the Indians had a big impact on shutting down farming.
In 1779, the Continental Army would retaliate against the raiders. American forces led by Generals John Sullivan and James Clinton march into Iroquois territory.
The Continental Force cut a swath through this area, destroying houses, destroying food supplies, doing everything that was possible to drive the Iroquois out of the war.
So it was mostly a cabin-burning, corn-chopping campaign. The soldiers spent more time killing corn than they did Indians.
However, with winter approaching and low on supplies, the Continental Army would not seriously threaten Fort Niagara.
From a military perspective, the raid is not terribly successful. It certainly does not put the Iroquois out of the war, although it does create a period of very bitter hardship for both the Iroquois and their British allies.
During the long, cold winter of 1779 and 80, hundreds of Iroquois, forced to take refuge at the fort, would starve. Though the Loyalist raiders would battle back, the American revolutionaries win the war. Even in victory, the new United States is in no position to force the British off the Great Lakes. It would take 11 years to resolve land claims and treaty disputes before Fort Niagara is finally handed over to the Americans.
When the British finally turn Fort Niagara over to the Americans in 1796, they're very quick to skirt right across the river and build a fort of their own.
Fort George stood only 3/4 of a mile away, across the new border in Canada.
Fort Niagara was never designed to be a border fortification. Its defenses, first of all, are facing the wrong direction. For the first time, the enemy is on the western side of the river, and all of these massive earthworks and all of the things that make Fort Niagara such a formidable obstacle are now just negated in one fell swoop.
In addition, Fort George's cannon batteries stand 9 feet higher.
With that 9 feet height differential, the guns of Fort George are able to command the parade ground at Fort Niagara. They're able to fire down into the fort itself.
Over time, the hostility of the American Revolution softens, and relations between the two sides become surprisingly cordial.
The British officers at Fort George, seeking any genteel society, befriended the American officers at Fort Niagara, and they would get together for shooting expeditions and have dinner together on one side or the other and that sort of thing.
But as a new century progressed, tensions between the nations would escalate and threaten the peace at Niagara. In June of 1812, the U.S. Congress, angered over violations of national sovereignty, declares war on Britain. When the news reaches the Niagara frontier, neither the Americans nor the British are prepared.
When word of the declaration of war arrived, there were several American officers from Fort Niagara who were having dinner with their British opposite numbers in the mess at Fort George.
You can imagine everyone jumping up and wine bottles knocked over as the Americans are perhaps more than a little concerned that they're on enemy territory. But according to the story, the officer in charge of the mess says, "Gentlemen, please be seated. Let's not let bad news ruin a good dinner."
They finished the meal in apparently cordial circumstances, and the U.S. officers were then allowed to return to Fort Niagara.
In October, cordial relations turned to conflict. In support of a land invasion by American troops, Niagara's batteries fire on Fort George. The British return fire, and with their height advantage, pulverize Fort Niagara. The costly lesson forces the Americans to make changes.
They do a number of things, not the least of which is to remove the roof from the stone house, the French castle, and turn the top floor into an elevated gun deck.
The alterations came just in time. On November 21st, Fort George's cannons again fire on Fort Niagara. The Americans return fire with heated cannonballs, hoping to start fires at Fort George.